The Black Night of Manoel. Manoel Island is a leaf-shaped island in Marsamuxet Harbour. It can be seen from Valletta, our capital city, and is connected to the mainland by bridge. I grew up there, sort of. Oh, we didn't live there, but my father worked on the island for his entire life, and my mother used to take me there to see the old fort and the boats in the marina and the yacht yard. She sold pastries and fruit juice to the boaters and the workers to bring in a little extra cash. My father, Mason Muscat, was the last man in my family to work on the island. He was following in the footsteps of his father, Maura Muscat, who started working there after the war. My great-grandfather, Zaran, was there during the war when the bombs fell, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My story begins with a history lesson, as all good stories do. Manoel Island has always held a special place in my heart, and so I've researched it as much as is possible for someone like me, someone who's not technically savvy and who didn't have much of an education. In 1570, 50 years after the height of the Renaissance, Manoel Island was acquired by the cathedral chapter of Medina, the old city. Medina was our capital city until the end of the Middle Ages, but these days there are only a couple of hundred people living within its walls. Another 10,000 or so live in Rabat, but there are 50 times as many as that in Valletta. When the island was bought by the Medinites, and you'll have to forgive me if I made that word up, it became the property of the Bishop of Malta. That was when it got its first name, Il Jazira Taliskov, which means Bishop's Island. Folks were pretty literal with their names back then. Not long afterwards, in 1592, there was an outbreak of the plague, which led to a quarantine hospital called the Lazaretto being built. That hospital was made out of wood, but it was replaced 50 years later by a more permanent one, like something out of the Three Little Pigs. There was a lot of plague around in those days, with much of it spread by ships, and so you can imagine how scared the locals were given how much we've historically relied on ships for trade. There was a lot of cholera around too. You'd think that my story had something to do with the hospital, but you'd be wrong. It has something to do with Fort Manoel. The fort was built by the Order of St. John over 10 years in the early 1700s, at the orders of Grand Master Antonio Manuel de Vilhena. Manuel lent the fort his name, and he comes back into the story later on. Life went on, and the island came to be known as Manoel Island after the fort. It was used as a garrison by British troops for a while before being turned into a hospital towards the end of the 20th century. That hospital was a throwback to the Lazaretto because while it wasn't built specifically to quarantine people and to stop the spread of the plague, they still fumigated and disinfected all of the incoming mail. The mail was then marked with red wax seals. My family still has a number of old letters with the red seals still visible on the envelopes, though the seals were broken when my great-great-great-grandfather set the envelopes open with his letter opener. A ton of famous faces stayed on Manoel Island throughout the years, from Lord Byron to Sir Walter Scott and Benjamin Disraeli. I couldn't tell you whether they stayed there under quarantine though. Other than the docks and the fort, it's not as though there's much to see. It's less than a square kilometre in size. During the Second World War, Malta came under siege. It was an important military target because the whole island was being used as a naval base. It was even given the name HMS Phoenicia as though she was a ship. In 1942, German bombers scored a direct hit on the Chapel of St. Anthony, which had been built as part of Fort Manoel. That spelled the end of Manoel Island's role in the war. The island was abandoned, and Fort Manoel and the Lazaretto were vandalised and used as hideouts for those who worked outside the law. It was a dark time for Manoel Island. Great-grandfather Zaran temporarily became the only man in 5 generations of Muscats who found work off the island. The stories vary, but I like to believe that he was a farm boy, though he must have been in his late 30s by the time that the guns fell silent. Fortunately for Zaran, he eventually found work on the island again. The Lazaretto was reopened as a hospital at the end of the 1940s, and he was employed first as a builder and handyman and later as a porter. He carried on working there until the day he died, dropping down dead of a heart attack in the middle of the cardiac ward. You can say this about great-grandfather Zaran. He had a natural flair for the dramatic. The Lazaretto closed for good in the 1970s after the British Navy left. By that time, my grandfather Mauro was working as a fisherman, and he used Manoel Island as his base of operations. Later, my father, Mason, was tasked with fixing up part of the Lazaretto to turn it into a shelter for abandoned dogs, which is how he met my mother. She was 10 years younger than him and barely out of her childhood when my father saw her feeding the dogs with scraps of food that she'd saved from her own family's table. And I'm glad he did, because that chance meeting on Manoel Island is the reason why I'm here today. These days, there are plans for Manoel Island to be restored and converted into houses, offices, shops and restaurants. If people can dream it, they've dreamt it for Manoel Island. There's even talk of building a casino and a couple of hotels with an underground car park to link them all together. My brother, Mikhail, is hoping to continue the family tradition and to work on the site with my nephew, Stefan, but perhaps it's just talk. I won't believe it until I see them bringing in the machinery. So you're probably wondering where the ghosts come in. Well, Manoel Island used to have 6 cemeteries, but they've been built on throughout the centuries, and so only one of them is left. I have no idea where the other 5 burial grounds are, but I guess that building on top of them didn't do much to help the ghost problem. It never does. Malta and Manoel Island are home to hundreds of ghosts if the reports are to be believed, but I want to tell you about the Black Night of Manoel. It all starts with the restoration of the fort. When work started on the restoration project, the authorities drafted people in from wherever they could get them, which is how my father came to be working alongside the French and the British. I wasn't there, so I can't swear to what exactly they said to one another, but I suppose it went something like this. There's a ton of graffiti here. Yeah, I know, it goes back years. This one's got a date, 1942. That might have been my father, Zaran, or perhaps one of his friends. They were stationed here during the war. 1681? There's a lot of history here. No kidding. Fellas. What's up, Dano? Can anyone else see what I'm seeing? What are you seeing? Look over there, behind the rubble. Holy. The story of what happened next was passed down from my grandfather, Maura, and has become something of a family legend. According to Maura, the ragtag bunch of Maltese and English workmen saw a knight watching them work. That's right, a knight. Grandpa Maura said he was dressed in a full set of battle armour that was painted a black so dark that it would have had Anish Kapoor in tears. It had taken them a while to notice him, because he'd been standing in the corner of a dark, cavernous cellar, watching silently as the men shovelled broken bricks into wheelbarrows or swept dust and dirt into dustpans. The Black Knight of Manoel, for that's who it was, had the white cross of the Order of St. John above his heart and his breastplate, as well as on the large shield that was slung across his back. He was holding a bastard sword in his hands, with the pommel towards the heavens and the tip digging into the ground. His great helm hid his eyes, although there was the faintest glint in the darkness as the light from one of their torches reflected from the Black Knight's black pupils. He was watching them while they worked. According to my grandfather, the men did what any sane men would do. They fled, hightailing it away from the lazaretto and towards the docks, where their supervisors caught up with them and docked them a day's wages. The Black Knight isn't like the other ghosts. He was the only one to have been seen by multiple people, and on multiple different occasions. My grandfather's sighting was just the first. As work continued, more of the workmen said that they saw him, and a priest was brought in to bless the sight. Sure enough, he carried out the blessing and spent the day and part of the following night with the workmen, only to ditch his robes and swim back to the city in the early hours, telling anyone who'd listened that the stories were true and that Manoel Island was cursed and plagued by devils. More of the locals visited the island, with 1 or 2 amateur historians pointing out that the Black Knight looked a great deal like Grandmaster Manuel de Vilcana, the guy who'd ordered the building of the fort 300 years ago. Now, you're probably wondering how they knew what he looked like. I know I did when my father first told me this story. He answered my question without a word by taking me on a public tour of the President's Palace, where a painting of the old Grand Master still hangs proud on the opulent walls, staring balefully out at us mere peasants as we go about our business. But let's get back to the ghost of the Black Knight, who continued to make unexpected and unannounced appearances in the ruins of the old fort. No one knows what he wanted or why he suddenly started to appear. The best guess that I ever heard came from the workmen, who say they found a crypt beneath a chapel in the fort. Of course, it doesn't take a genius to know that it's a bad idea to disturb the bones of the dead, but by all accounts, the Vandals had beat them to it. There wasn't much left of the chapel, and the remains of those who'd been buried there had been scattered throughout the ruins. That included the bones of Charles-François de Mondion, the architect who'd been instrumental in the fort's design. The altar and reliefs bearing the crucifix and a depiction of the souls in purgatory were also damaged. Apparently, Grandmaster de Vilcana wasn't too happy. The Black Knight of Manoel continued to make sporadic appearances when he was least expected, a state of affairs that carried on for the best part of a decade until the renovations were completed. The brief was extended to cover the crypt and the chapel, which were restored to their former glory. The last sighting of the Black Knight came the night before the first mass was carried out at the newly refurbished chapel. Or at least, the last sighting for a while. You see, the Black Knight started reappearing in the 80s, but this time the old-timers knew exactly where to look. A group of workmen, which included my father, made their way into the crypt and found that it had been vandalised again. We never did figure out who was behind the damage, but I doubt it was a local. The locals weren't that stupid. The Black Knight of Manoel never seemed threatening, although he didn't exactly look friendly. For most of us, it was reassuring to know that he was there and that he'd raise his armoured head from time to time. He was like the Maltese army. It's nice to know that they're there, but you wouldn't want them round for dinner. As far as I know, the crypt has been protected since those last appearances and the Black Knight has never returned, but it can only be a matter of time. After all, the lazaretto is being renovated, and the fools behind the plans have decided to bulldoze the crypt and build over it. Perhaps the Black Knight will make them change their minds before it's too late. Or perhaps he'll bow down to the inevitable and let them build.